Hello and welcome. My name's Andy Reid. I'm the director of the Sports Think-Tank, and today we're joining one of the 29 organisations that have helped us in our 2024 manifesto project. We were challenged to come up with policy ideas for a new government after the next election, which would probably not have great resource implications. As we all know, the economy and the public finances are in a position where spending is going to be very difficult for the next period. So these individual organisations have come together. We've created the pamphlet, which is available on our website, but we wanted to give each of the contributors a little bit more time to expand on what they're trying to say in their chapter. So let's head over to the next one in this series of this Sports Think Tank 2024 manifesto. So hello and welcome to the latest podcast in this series on the 100 policy ideas for the manifesto. And today I'm delighted to be joined probably, I'd say an old friend, that's the wrong way of putting it really, isn't it? But a good friend over a period of time, Duncan Wood-Allum from SLC. And as always, I'm going to let Duncan introduce how we got to where he is at the moment, and then a little bit about who SLC are and where that then fits into the fantastic chapter that we're going to sort of dive into a little bit more detail in a few seconds. So Duncan, how did you end up here?
Well, firstly, Andy, thanks ever so much for inviting me on. Really delighted to be here. Gosh, where did I start? Well, I was a state schoolboy hockey player, which was quite a rare thing back in the 80s. And that inspired me to get very interested in the industry. And I ended up working as a lifeguard at the age of 17 in inner city Leicester for 3 summers, and then went off to Loughborough University and did a recreation management degree, and then got straight into operating community use facilities for 10 years. I ended up building 2, setting up 2 from scratch, and thoroughly enjoying it, and then got obsessed with quality systems in leisure management, ended up doing an MBA around that, and then was lucky enough to run the Quest scheme in the early 2000s. So ran that for 3 years, then got more involved in national programmes run by Sport England, and moved into general leisure consultancy after that for a company called PMP, and then moved on to a company called Capita and ran all of their sport consulting and project management businesses for about 7 years, and was lucky enough to get involved in 2012 the bid and also delivery of the games. And then the credit crunch came, and at that point I decided that it was time to break out and set SLC up. And since 2009 we've been fortunate enough to be supporting local authorities, national agencies in trying to make a difference in people's lives.
Brilliant. That's a great backstory. Actually, I probably didn't know all of that, and so that's really helpful. I think I probably skipped over a bit of a decade of your sort of past, and but it's a good intersection, isn't it? Because I think probably today is about talking about a very particular part of the overall sector. But your background is that you have come through sport and other sort of areas along the way, and obviously concentrate in specific areas now through SLC. And I suppose that's what I wanted to pick up on. Really, it's probably a lot of people will have an interaction with their public leisure, or even if they don't, it's like a lot of those public services, isn't it? They like it to be there even if they don't use it.
Yes.
And in a way, you know, there's a lot of analysis around at the moment about the problems, which would be good for you to sort of let us know a little bit more about. And then, you know, this sort of what I think you've framed, isn't it, this pivot to health and well-being. But just run through, for those who aren't really au fait, the great thing about these chapters is, as you've seen, it goes from play right through to elite sport. But just an understanding, as you do in your chapter, really, about the background to how we've got this sort of public sector leisure stock, you know, after that big boom in the sort of 60s, 70s and 80s, wasn't it? And where we are now with it, and why there are so many sort of problems that the sector faces.
Yeah, I think back in the sort of 70s and 80s, there was a significant amount of investment in public assets and lots of sports centres. You know, fairly traditional sports centres were built of various sizes. It was an amenity to have, and lots of local authorities were very proud to make sure that each town had decent provision. In the 80s and 90s, we saw more dual-use provision being developed, and obviously with the advent of the National Lottery, that really was a shot in the arm for facility investment. Not all of that was strategic, arguably, and often a lot of the buildings were built without whole life costs in mind or overall longevity. So we ended up building what an old friend of mine called Mark Downs, who was at Sport England back in the early 2000s, called the facilities iceberg, of this huge amount of older stock getting older and older more inefficient, and actually not really meeting the modern requirements of a broader range of users.
Yeah.
And a lot of councils and local authorities have had the opportunity to refresh that stock, rationalise, modernise, which has been great. Obviously, the private sector market has evolved significantly since then, but we've still got that headache and hangover, and a lot of councils are struggling with very old stock, obviously with higher utility costs. There's a concern around decarbonisation, and for many, we're getting to a crunch point where some councils are having to say, yikes, we just can't keep doing this. And the operators that are trying to run those buildings are quite understandably saying, look, we need a bit more help here. We ourselves can't replace the roof or replace the boilers. There's been a bit of short-term support from the government through the swimming pool recovery fund, which is welcome. But I understand that out of the 60 million that was available, 127 million was requested.
Yeah.
So we know there's a huge gap, and there's no easy solution to fixing that at the moment, Andy.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's almost like a bit of a perfect storm over this period, isn't there? Because you've got, as you say, that ageing stock and changing needs for that stock. At the same time, and I don't know if you've done the figures, but we broadly tend to talk about the spend in local government on leisure has probably reduced from its peak of around 1.6 billion to under £1 billion. So you've also stripped out £600 million broadly from that sort of spend at the same time that you've got increased energy prices and ageing stock, etc. So we are in a bit of a perfect storm here, aren't we?
It's been really tricky. Obviously, COVID knocked the stuffing out of the sector. It also exposed some of those more vulnerable portfolios, which quite frankly should have been knocked down years and years and years ago and replaced, but for whatever reason they weren't. Cost of living crisis, obviously the increase in utility costs again delivered a double whammy for the sector. So it's been very, very tough. But out of that crisis has emerged some stronger operational processes. A lot of leisure operators have adapted incredibly well to new markets, to doing things more efficiently and effectively. And interestingly enough, we run almost half the UK leisure procurements to find new operators to run public sector services. Some of the management fees that they're paying back to councils now are in excess of those pre-COVID. And in addition to that, they're delivering a lot more social value as well, a lot more outreach, a lot more programs, a lot more sensitivity around changing their pricing to be more inclusive. So it's not all doom and gloom, Andy, but the big headache is that really the leisure centre model, the traditional sort of 70s, 80s, 90s leisure centre model, doesn't really hit the spot in terms of supporting improving population health, because it's just not touching enough lives.
Yeah. And that's, you're so knowledgeable about this sort of very, the procurement process and what it is. Is it worth just explaining a little bit about the variety of slightly different models there are? Sort of in Leicestershire, I know we've got several different models within house in some of the authorities, trusts, and others. So is it just worth, because most people just see a leisure centre and just assume it's the councils, and there's a bit more to it than that, isn't there?
It's a really good point, because I also want to talk about the service delivery model as well.
Sure.
Because arguably that's more important, because what we've traditionally fallen into is that in order to deliver leisure services and well-being, you need to build leisure centres. And I use the word leisure centres deliberately there. What we are now finding, and all the work that Sport England have been doing around their place-based working, is actually you can get more people moving more often within community settings, at home, at work, through travel, through schools, community groups, church groups, that sort of thing. So arguably the service delivery model of how do we actually invest public money to get more people active and keep them well and prevent them from becoming ill and improving their lives is not necessarily dependent on having a leisure centre in your patch. However, we do have a lot of them, and often they form a very big portfolio of facilities, swimming pools, leisure facilities, gyms, studios, you name it, often linked to parks and outdoor facilities as well. Often you've got running tracks or them linked to school facilities, college facilities, that sort of thing. Now, they can be run in very different ways. Now, the classic traditional model from probably the 70s and 80s was a council would run its own leisure service itself. I used to be in an in-house operation, and we were very proud, and we thought we were brilliant. I worked with the great Ken Dunbar at Tandridge District Council, and we were pretty good, to be fair. Ken's a bit of a star. but that was arguably quite an inefficient way of running things because there were no economies of scale. However, absolute local control, the local politicians that were responsible for that service could pick up the phone to me or Ken, and they could get things done that day. And ultimately, the buck stopped with us, and the buck stopped with those elected members. There was no one to blame. And there are some really successful in-house services running across the country. You know, Wigan Be-Well service, I would say, is probably top of the pile for me. They're absolutely exceptional. Very, very good in-house service. And so, you know, there are good examples of different types of services through all the management models. So doing it yourself, I call it DIY, can work, but it needs to be resourced properly. And it does carry additional costs because all the staff are on local government terms and conditions. They've all got fantastic pensions, and quite rightly they should, because they're public servants. But of course, also you've got to be then reliant on the council's internal systems to run that 365-day service, which sometimes can be challenging. And often people working in house operations, the bits they can control, they're absolutely comfy, happy with, customers love it. But the bits they may be reliant on some of the back office support services, it's maybe not so good at times. But, you know, opportunities to improve that. And still some councils are looking at doing that. And often there's a political preference to try and run things yourself, you know, particularly in some Labour-run authorities. So that's one model. The next model is almost a halfway house between somebody else running it for you or the council actually fully controlling and running it itself. So that would be through a local authority trading company. And that's basically an arm's length organisation that can primarily only trade within the boundaries of its own local authority area. It can do a little bit of stuff outside, but mainly 80% of its activities need to be within that borough area or that unitary authority area. And we're seeing some very successful local authority trading companies operating. Broom's active in Harrogate springs to mind. That's part of the North Yorkshire Council now, but they've developed a very, very good reputation over time. And also there's a CIC in Stockport, which is the equivalent of a local authority trading company, called Life Leisure, run by John Oxley, which is doing some fantastic work with a local authority there. So again, some great examples. Those organisations don't have big economies of scale. They do have a degree of autonomy. They'll have their own board, albeit often that board will have representatives from the council. So there is still a fair amount of influence and control over that local authority trading company. But you might end up getting a little bit more innovation and a little bit more autonomy with that kind of arrangement, and that's quite popular. So that's two. So you've had your in-house, you have your local authority.
Told you it was complicated, you know.
Or community interest company type option. The third one is quite a big one, and has developed and become very, very popular, which is called the outsourced option, which is more of a partnering arrangement with a large multi-site operator. So some of these multi-site operators, you know, I won't mention any names because I'll miss one out and then somebody will get grumpy, but you know, people can do their research. Often some of these organisations are running between 100 and 300 sites, often in regional areas. So what you get with that, you get some significant economies of scale. What they've also been able to do is specialise in different areas. So some are very much focusing on health and fitness, and obviously making sure that they can have a very, you know, high performing offer, because that drives a lot of revenue. Some are also focusing on providing more elite sport venues. So you've got a number of the multi-sites that are operating local authorities, you know, elite sports venues, for example, in Lee Valley Park, that sort of thing, or in Sheffield and Manchester. And then you've also got some of these multi-sites that specialise in some of the slightly niche areas, like things like Lidos, for example. So they've developed specialisms there. So one of the real benefits of that is you can tell them ask them exactly what to do through a service specification. And this is something that me and my colleagues at SLC geek out on a little bit, because we've taken these service specifications, sounds very dull, doesn't it, to a very progressive level for councils that want to really stretch and push and work collaboratively with their local authority operating partner. And there's some fantastic work going on. And for example, great example is Northumberland. They've recently gone from a local trust running their services to partnering with a new multi-site operator. They've made significant savings, but also the offer is going to improve significantly. There's a lot more outreach. It's a lot more aligned to public health outcomes. And it's the public health team that are actually overseeing and clienting that contract in partnership with that operator. So for many councils they want good control, they want good value for money. In many cases, they will be paid a management fee back, which they can then reinvest in other services or support some of the other financial challenges that they're facing. And arguably, the reason we got involved in all this procurement business was because it was run very poorly about 10 years ago, and nobody was happy. The operators weren't happy. Elected members were pulling their hair out saying, gosh, we can't, we really don't feel we're in control of this, and our residents are not happy. So that's why SLC got involved, and we've arguably sort of shaken that process up a little bit. We've ended up writing the national guidance for service delivery with Sport England, and we like to set the standard on that. And it's an area where we think actually, and this doesn't necessarily need to be through an outsourced arrangement, the specification and the governance of these partnerships are the things that can make the biggest difference to communities and getting people active, because we've got 2,500 of these facilities across the country already. The infrastructure's already there, and my frustration is that we don't want to reinvent the wheel here. We've got a lot of fantastic infrastructure. It's just maybe how it works and who it's working for are the little adjustments we need to make to start making these buildings a lot more inclusive and attractive to people that maybe aren't so sporty or keen on donning all the lycra and kit and going in and with ripped abs, because that's not what we're about anymore. We're about keeping people well. So they're the three main options. There's lots of other sort of sub options there, and some councils do want a mixed economy. There's joint ventures. I won't bore people with all of that, but they're the three main ones. And I think from our perspective, each model can work really well, and it's all about how you design that governance and be very, very clear about what's really, really important to your local community, and also the relationship of control as well is quite key. I hope that wasn't too dull for your listeners, Andy.
No, that's really helpful, because actually this is why podcasts work a little bit easier, isn't it? Because you've had to write a whole book on how that all works. But I think just bringing it to life and explaining with real life examples what that sort of looks like just really makes it's not as complicated as sometimes we make it sound. Clearly there's a lot of detail behind that, but that's for me that's a real essence of this. And actually what it's really helpful in doing, Duncan, is then sort of pulls out some of the themes that you then sort of develop. So we talked about the ageing stock and then those challenges, but in that specification, as you said, because we do use the word leisure centres, but we're talking about something slightly different in your pivot to health, isn't it? And those community assets. So do you want to describe that sort of part of the journey as well? Because with my hat on, in particular, if you're tackling inequalities, it's not going to be done through the traditional models, is it? So how are you helping local authorities switch that thinking just away? And clearly, let's bottom it out. They need to make these things pay as well. They can't just run them at total losses. So how are they dealing with that dichotomy of sort of doing more outreach and more in the community with people who probably can't afford the fees that they currently charge for their current stock? And that's the space you're in now, isn't it? Trying to square that circle.
Yeah, I think we'll start. If I can sort of start with almost the end game for an active wellbeing model, and then we'll work our way back to how people make the transition. Because within our paper, we're not saying this is a silver bullet. We're saying, you know what, this is really hard to do, and it might take a decade to make that transition. And it might be useful also, and we've set this out, is that this kernel of an idea was generated in Greater Manchester through the Greater Manchester local authorities, and we were fortunate enough to be invited to support them in developing this concept of shifting a standard leisure service to a much broader place-based approach, which is now called and embraced by Sport England as active wellbeing. Now, we use the word pivot. Some people don't like pivot. I don't really care what word we use. It's about the outcome ultimately. But what we're saying is that the service at the moment is lots of buildings doing things, and everything's a bit fragmented and not joined up. And what we want to do is, again, taking some of Sport England's approach to place to say, look, we've got a whole system here. We've got infrastructure, we've got social networks, we've got sports clubs, we've got schools, we've got church groups, we've got some public sector infrastructure, some private sector infrastructure. Why don't we collaborate a bit more? Why don't we talk to each other? And most importantly, why don't we talk to folk who live in the places and find out what's most important to them, rather than imposing a solution on them that's a bit cookie cutter? And the early evidence of that is that people love that. Now the thing is, you can't make that transition in a binary way. It takes time, and it needs to be co-developed with those communities as well. So what we're looking for is this sort of place-based approach that involves the local authority. They've got to play a very leading, a facilitating and enabling role in all of this. Public health play an absolutely key part in this, because they will help you laser focus on which health inequalities in that area require the most attention. The role of the integrated care partnership is absolutely critical, because ultimately they're the ones that are dictating where the funding's going. Now, at the moment, they're focusing on fixing stuff, not preventing stuff. We're hoping, potentially with a new government, there's going to be a greater focus on prevention moving forwards. But also, we need to be involving adult social care. We need to be involving children's services, because the leisure offer, the active wellbeing offer, can play a massive role in supporting those cohorts in living a better life and addressing some of the challenges that they're facing. And then we shouldn't forget the voluntary sector. We've got sports clubs, we've got charities, residents themselves, residents groups, friends groups of parks. So this is a movement, and this whole shift is very, very exciting. And I think the traditional leisure sector is kind of almost, if you imagine this is a dance floor, they've been sitting at the back, sipping their pint, watching what's going on and trying to work out what the move is. And actually, those that have piled in and started dancing are actually starting to enjoy it and doing quite well. And they're creating new networks and relationships. And all of a sudden, it's creating collaborations and partnerships that might include social care, that might include health, that may include your local GPs. So this is happening. Obviously, Sport England are piling in a lot of investment into this over the next 5 years, which is great. But my big underlining of this is, do not forget the infrastructure that we already have, because that's the thing that can actually get results quickest. If we can help people develop these specs so that they're meeting more local needs more effectively, that's brilliant. If we can make them more inclusive, more welcoming for people, if we can get those services facing outwards rather than inwards, we don't want them all coming into the leisure centre paying it's got to be, you've got to have this satellite hub type approach, which is something that North Yorkshire Council have just embraced very recently. And quite frankly, it will start knocking the numbers up in terms of the type of people that are moving more often, informally, through your formal structures, etc. And then we get that shift, and then hopefully we get less people on waiting lists, and hopefully the NHS suddenly has a bit of space to breathe. So that in a nutshell, that's what that pivot to active well-being looks like. But it
sounds easier said than done.
It's hard to do.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely easier said than done, isn't it? Given that, where we're at now, the need for that still to probably, I know from some of those we talk to locally, they're under pressure to do the figures. They've got to balance their books given their existing stock. So that shift is not going to be overnight, is it, Duncan?
It's a great point, Andy, and I think I'll come back to the initial question you asked me earlier on. Is one has to create the conditions, and within our paper, we're suggesting some of the conditions that need to be created for that transition to take place. Now, one of them is about strategic focus, because there needs to be a collective view that the system is going to focus on addressing deep inequalities rather than provide universal services for everybody, which will tend to favour the well. And that's why if you look at the typical profile of people that use public leisure centres, they're all quite well. And the public health directors are going, they're not the people we want to be helping. The private sector can do a fantastic job looking after those folk. So we need to be redirecting who our customers are and who the people we want to support in lots of different ways to become more active. Linked to that comes back to the facilities and the iceberg that we talked about. You can't do this stuff if you've got knackered old buildings. And they're not helping your net zero targets. They're costing a fortune. Councils that are still subsidising leisure centres have really got to stop and think, because at some point you're going to run out of cash. So if that's the situation you're in, there are ways to move away from that. And we're working with some local authorities in Greater Manchester at the moment that are genuinely looking to shake things up a little bit and look at different ways of providing probably moving away from a leisure centre service into a much more place-based set of interventions. One local authority's got something like 32 health trainers working across the community, rather than piling it into patching up an old knackered sports centre. So, there's different ways of getting the same outcomes, which is healthy people. That's our mission, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway.
Yeah.
So creating those conditions, I think, are really key. Another key thing on the conditions is relationships. And one of the things in our paper is saying we want a different relationship with the Integrated Care Partnership, which is in effect the strategic body that oversees where the health money is being spent. Now, again, that relationship and building that trust and building the evidence base to demonstrate that, hey, the stuff we're all doing in our parks and our community centres and in our active wellbeing hubs is actually really making a difference to those people who have health inequalities is going to be the key to success in the longer term. And that's something that, we're being quite ambitious about, and we know, again, Sporting get it, which is great. They're supporting that, which is fantastic. And, organisations like New Local get it, everybody's getting whole systems apart from this government at the moment, Andy.
Well, I probably won't go down that route too much from my point of view, but I guess I probably agree. But you're right. I mean, there is this sort of shift, isn't there? And I suppose there's a couple of things sort of spring to mind out of what you've just said there, Duncan. I suppose is the profile of the existing. You've said it already, haven't you? It's sort of I've done this for years. It's the worried well who actually use not just leisure, but actually the health service. It's always demonstrated, actually, from the 80s onwards, the ham sort of stuff. It's the worried well who benefit most from the service that we've sort of created. I suppose local authorities have found themselves in that sort of space as well, haven't they? But I suppose you did mention politics, so I can't sort of avoid it. I suppose there are difficult, I don't know how you help your clients and others manage this, but it is very difficult to close down a swimming pool, a leisure centre as a politician. So easy, logically, you could take a rational, strategic view of what you've got, and then you've got a bunch of councillors who don't want a swimming pool closed in their patch. So that's there's a sort of like perfect policy scenario, and then there's reality. So how do you help people manage that process? Because it can be done, can't it? But it's I'm sure there's some skills behind it.
It can, and one thing we've been working really hard on is trying to through visuals and images start communicating some of the challenges and some of the opportunities around making that shift. Interestingly enough, one of my clients was telling me that we'd spent 6 months on a very sort of strategic piece of work, trying to sort of say to politicians, you can't afford to keep running what you've got, so you've now got to shrink down and just provide minimum swimming provision, for example. But it'll be really good, and actually it'll address some of the issues around inequalities of kids not being able to swim, and water safety is a key thing. And also you have a statutory duty around swimming. So you have to do this stuff. And that was all going well, and then one politician changes their mind, and all of a sudden they want to build an all-singing, all-dancing Palace of Delights, which is great. Let's do that too and make sure we get the swimming sorted. So telling the story in a simple and compelling way is key. We are finding that members are absolutely embracing the concept of active well-being, and if you follow the North Yorkshire Council journey, you've got a local authority there that's absolutely designing their whole service around this concept. Not just the leisure service, this is the whole system. We know in Cumbria local authorities are looking to do that as well, which is exciting. We're working with a number of authorities right now. Wigan in particular, are getting it. They're starting to do some exploratory work around what happened if they amend and adapt the leisure centres, some of the leisure centres they've got that are getting a little bit old, and flip them into active wellbeing hubs, working with partners to develop and design those models. What could that look like? Now that work's being modelled, and some of that work is linking to the work we've been doing in Greater Manchester around the Pivot to Active Wellbeing programme. Some of those model designs of these wellness hubs and the business cases behind them will be in the public domain fairly soon, hopefully, along with some fantastic case studies of what does this stuff actually mean? Because it's very easy for us to sort of pontificate and sort of create the grand vision, but people want to see practical examples and they want to see some evidence.
Yeah, and I suppose that's what this is a little bit about, isn't it? Because we've heard of these and wellbeing hubs, and I've been quite keen to see where we can using other sources of funding. So I know, particularly around the Levelling Up funds, that a number of authorities have put in their bids these wellbeing hubs, and we all say that they're great, we love this, but it's just trying to understand what it looks like to people, isn't it? So it's a good concept to get behind, and I don't expect you to go too far in this podcast outlining what is coming, but could you explain just what they do physically look like and what services they find and where and how you locate them? Which, going back to that place-based stuff, do they just become another place that some people find difficult to access, or do you make them really local and community-led, as you suggested earlier in the way you design them?
It's a really good point, Andy. I think if you can imagine a range of different services in a location where the need is greatest, where they are as accessible as possible. So if you imagine where people plonk supermarkets, they tend to be places where you can walk and spend your money. And we've almost got to develop this mindset in terms of where do we actually put these services. So some of the early work around co-location, I was heavily involved in the Orford Park Jubilee Neighbourhood Hub, back in the 2012 when that opened, and there was a lot of learning from that scheme. And there's examples of this all over the country. Typically, what they've got is they've got some aspects of leisure. So they'll probably have swimming pool, they'll probably have hydrotherapy, they'll probably have a gym. The gyms may be more focused on less active, sporty people, so you may not see all the weights in there. They'll be a bit more welcoming. There may be a community library. You may be able to pay your council tax. Citizens' advice might be based there. Local physios might be there. The GP office might be there. There could be a sexual health clinic in there. So basically, what we're saying is there is no sort of off-the-shelf facility mix for this. It's about actually services coming together and saying, look, what would best work for this particular community? Dental services has been in the press, hasn't it, recently? Dentistry, and looking for the synergies between those services. So we're working with a number of clients at the moment on what's the best mix and how can we get the right partners together. Now that in itself is challenging. And I think another challenge is that 5 years ago everybody's saying co-location, it's the way forward. It's it's garlic bread, it's brilliant. Co-location isn't great because what you do is you have lots of silos within a building. So you've got the librarians not talking to the community leisure folk, not talking to the GPs, and they've all got separate waiting rooms and separate entrances. And yes, it's convenient and it's arguably a bit of a one-stop shop, but none of the systems are joined up, and you have to fill in your details when you go in there 3 different times, and it's all a bit confusing for folk. So what we're now talking about is to say, well, co-location it's a bit of a low bar now. Why don't we think about integrating and building a service that is multifaceted around people's needs? So, they can be signposted and supported rather than bumped around the system. And we know systems change is complicated and complex, particularly when we're looking at the NHS and we're looking at adult social care. But we've got to start thinking, because there's less money, there's less buildings, there's more demand. Isn't there a smarter way of us joining our services together and integrating them around the needs of local people and their families? And that's something we're working on at the moment with a number of clients. So in some ways, you think of pick and mix, but driven by local need and what's important to local people.
Yeah. So by definition, everyone would look slightly different given the local different populations and the places they're trying to serve, isn't it? Yeah. But also, I suppose that's a challenge back into the way government delivers its services, isn't it? So, having for all of you who don't tend to use public services very much, and then when you do, just you come against a system that isn't very sort of individually centred, is it? It sort of works for the bureaucracy, not for the individual. So there's a bit of a rethink in that.
Yeah.
And you're also right. Some of the stuff you're saying in your policy recommendations here. Obviously the funding stuff for local government is important, but it's also that health bit, isn't it? And this place-based. So there will be place-based money, and there is health money, and there is a greater emphasis on prevention. But I suppose the reality, everybody, it's nice and easy to say. Again, this is where the politics comes, isn't it? We're sort of keen on prevention rather than the cure. But then when you've got 7 million people on a waiting list and pressures on NHS accidents and emergency, they always seem to be at the forefront. So making that break between getting through the winter crisis and investing. Have you seen examples where you've been able to demonstrate across the country to authorities? Because it does happen, but are there places where you have managed to make that shift and people really see the benefits of it, even though there's not an immediate short-term sort of payback for them?
I think we've got some very good local examples across the country. Some fantastic work going on in Stockport at the moment around that. It tends to be working better in unitary authorities where there's a more direct link between public health and the the active, I like to call it active wellbeing service now. So that's very positive, but it is in pockets. And the challenge we've got is that we are working in spite of the system rather than as part of the system. And now we can't change that. We can influence and we can keep lobbying, and with your fantastic manifesto, keep influencing. But fundamentally, the way local government structures itself, the way health structures itself, the way social care is structured and funded, needs to evolve, and we need to embrace this whole systems way of thinking. We also need to embrace, and a number of cities and places are doing this, the concept of proportionate universalism. Now, I'm sure you'll get Martin Allison on at some point. You can explain it better than anybody else. But we've got to direct resources at the folk that would most benefit from it, rather than the people that it's a bit like the concessions for the over 60s at the leisure centre that have just parked their Mercedes and think, oh, this is wonderful, I'm getting a free swim, fabulous.
Yes.
And there's a mum and her kids wanting to go in and have a swim, they can't afford it. That's what's wrong, and we can fix that stuff. So this shift to prevention is, quite frankly, this is going to be the job of the new government, and it's all of our job to keep hammering that message home. And I know Kim Leadbeater is championing that absolutely fantastically well, and we're so lucky to have her. And it's a no-brainer. It's an absolute no-brainer, Andy. And if we can achieve one thing, and ultimately get people shifting upstream to prevention, and stopping kids' teeth rotting, stopping children. We've got 50% of kids are obese by the time they're 12. Stopping them getting obese, or stopping 25% of that 50% getting obese, then we are going to save billions downstream. And the cost of those interventions upstream are so much cheaper than fixing the problem when somebody's ill. Now, it's not rocket science, this, but yet we've got a system that's designed to fix the sick people when it's too late. And you say it's not rocket science, and I think we sort of all agree with that. But we've got some really good stuff from working with Demos. They've done most of the work, but Demos on sort of why in government it is so rare that some of those long-term investments. The example they look at is things like Sure Start. Probably is a perfect policy model where identified a problem, worked with people to create solutions. They all looked different, but they were a long-term investment in getting young people educated, not waiting till they were 14 to 16, just before their sort of GCSEs, but at 3, 4, 5, where you sort of do that. But that's a rare win, I'm afraid, in sort of that long-term thinking. So you're right, is that I think lots of people get it, but shifting the machinery of government and the finances to do it is a tough act, which is what part of this is. Kim's doing a great job of leading on that, but we just need it embedded much more into the policymakers. Absolutely. And there's one thing I think that our sector can do, the physical activity sector can do now, which it's not doing, and we're highlighting this issue, and I've flagged it in the paper. It's around our workforce. So coming on to that next, you always read my mind, Duncan. There you go. Are you happy for me to
Absolutely, that's perfect segue into
So we've sort of talked about, isn't this active wellbeing thing fab? Localities are embracing it. Everybody's in their own way exploring it, moving towards it, which is great. There's actually not a lot of material out there, so we need to get the good material that has been worked up out there and shared and improved, because everything needs to be worked on and refined. But one thing we've found, a former colleague of mine, Marcus Kingwell, when he was with us, he did a fantastic piece of work asking the question, is this leisure workforce able to deliver active wellbeing interventions? And if not, what needs to happen in order that we've got a workforce that can actually deliver more complex interventions and support for people with long-term health conditions or multiple conditions? Now, sadly, within our sector, the way the professional frameworks have developed, everybody's working in silos. So the Chartered Institute of Physiotherapists are working over there with their own system, CPD structures, frameworks, qualifications. The NHS health people are over there. SIMSPA is down here, and we're still training duty managers and swimming instructors. And I think we're starting to do the Odd Health Navigator, which is very, very positive. But what we found is that nobody in our sector is owning this problem. This is slightly controversial, and please shoot me down. I hope I'm wrong. but from the research we did, and Liz Terry is going to be publishing an article in Health Club Management where we ask the question and we shine a light on this to say, hey, is it just us, or is everybody ignoring the workforce bit? That even though we want to move towards a more preventative role, I know for a fact that my friend and colleague Mark Tweedy up in Harrogate
Yeah.
is developing his own training programs to deliver more complex interventions in communities because nobody else is making them available. They're literally not in the system.
Yeah.
So we're very, very keen to shine a light on this, Andy, because quite frankly, we're a people business, and we know the impact that we've had with brilliant people that have worked in the sector over the years and that we've now got in the sector. But they could do so much more if they're equipped with broader skills that are more joined up, that are aligned and recognised and respected by health commissioners, by health colleagues, because we're all actually in the same business of trying to keep people well. And yet, arguably, the leisure sector hasn't got the skills to do it, and at the moment can't get the skills to do it. Now, I think that's wrong, and we're not going to shut up until somebody starts taking notice.
That's great, because actually, as you know, we've spoken to Jenny from Active IQ, we're talking to others about the importance of the workforce, and I do think, we talked a little bit about the politics of it and perception. I think it does feel sometimes when I talk to politicians is that, as you've highlighted, there's a bit of a crisis in public health. If we've got some health money to pay for the existing people in the gyms, I know this is perception, but that perception persists, I think, in some places, is that actually we're struggling, so we'll try and get some health money to do the stuff we already did.
Yeah.
And you're right, the workforce thing is really quite crucial, because you need to gain the confidence of those other areas in health, that actually we're not just giving you to a gym instructor who hasn't really got that much experience of dealing with complex health conditions. Now, that's a paraphrasing, and there are lots of really good people in the sector who know how to look after people with long-term health conditions. But, my wife's had ME, and I'm very surprised how few people in the sector understand that actually just pushing people with ME is the worst thing you should do. There are some really clever people and they get it, but I sometimes worry that they know one particular model and not necessarily the complexity of lots of conditions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there is hope, Andy. The Prehab for Cancer scheme in Greater Manchester, run by GM Active in partnership with health partners, is a great example of what can be done when you get the best of our sport physical activity sector working with the best of health on some big problems, and the outcomes that those patients preparing for operations or interventions are getting are investable, and there's an ambition to actually expand that scheme way beyond the current scope of sort of 2,000-3,000 patients a year. I think the ambition is to push that to 10,000 to 15,000. What I'm struggling with is that program's not getting a lot of help at the moment in terms of funding from, I won't mention the names of the organisations, but you can imagine who I might mention. I don't understand why they're not getting absolutely accelerated on funding and supported. You've got 12 local authority leisure trusts funding arguably the most fundamentally important programme in our sector to demonstrate that we can do the big grown-up stuff. And they're being left to it themselves. So
there's two things there. You're entirely right. There are some really, and this is what I get frustrated with, some really good examples of the stuff that works, and that's one. I've come across that one, and I think we're going to try and do some work really just to highlight, probably with your help, but just highlight the bits that do work so it can be replicated. But then I suppose the second bit to that is that whilst I talked earlier of prevention often being expensive and then but it takes a long time to hit back or pay back, there are examples like this where actually you can see the immediate payback. So not every intervention is a long-term, let's wait 20 years before we get £2 billion of savings. There's plenty of stuff, isn't there, that's quite immediate.
Absolutely. And I think we've got to use the tools and the work that we've got. Moving communities, it's a new data platform that's starting to get national level data, and then if that can have more investment, that can start providing much better quality local data, not just on facility based activities, but it's already starting to reach out and look at more community based interventions to develop some stats on that. I think one thing I'm really excited about is how we measure social value and the impact and the cashable and non-cashable savings from the work that our sector delivers every day. Now, interestingly enough, there's going to be a new social value measure developed, and it's currently being worked up by a company called State of Life, potentially around a HM Treasury backed model called the Wellbe, which is the Wellbeing Life Year, which is a sort of brother or sister to the QALY which is the quality of life year, which is something which is nationally accepted, it's credible, it's got all the science behind it. So arguably we're moving in the right direction, but I'm questioning, are we throwing enough resource to accelerate this so it can start making a difference, ideally within an electoral cycle?
Yeah. So the good news is obviously State of Life and the Wellbeing do get a chapter, because I'm a big fan of the work that they've been doing. Exactly because of that, the Green Book, there is an additional wellbeing supplement to the Treasury's Green Book. So actually wellbeing should be there, but other podcasts you'll have heard, but I do teach civil servants in this, and when I ask, we get 60 a month over the year. Only 2 or 3 hands go up each time amongst these project delivery civil servants who've heard of the supplementary guidance on wellbeing. So there's a bit of working internally in government to get done on that. But I entirely agree with you. It's the way we need to go more broadly, is to measure the wellbeing, not the GDP or GVA growth.
Yeah. Because I was just going to make one final point.
Sure.
Sadly, I'm still, when I often see monitoring and evaluation of our services, it's still telling me how many people went for a swim. It doesn't even say who they were, which wards they live in, what their socioeconomic status is. We've got to move on from this. There are some maturing monitoring and evaluation systems, again, in pockets around the country. But again, the national bodies, I will not mention any names, they've got to start throwing some resource at this. You can't rely on an individual organisation to develop a very sophisticated M&E monitoring and evaluation approach. Yeah. This has to be done nationally, scaled, replicated, bespoke to those local areas. That's where the effort needs to be going right now.
Yeah. And again, Duncan, as we probably start to draw to a close, I told you we'd be fine without drawing breath. But there's just 2 other sort of big bits, really. And when you do mention, I suppose the first is just this around, we mentioned the old Stark and carbon footprint. I've used stats from a couple of reports that probably a lot of local authorities, 40% of their carbon footprint comes from their leisure centre, swimming pool sort of stuff. So raise that with colleagues, and there are some solutions. So it'd be worth talking on that. And then also, you just did mention about inequalities in the workforce. Won't name it, but I just had feedback from somebody from an organisation who, was at a recent conference in this sort of part of the sector, in which he was only one of 3 sort of ethnically diverse faces in a room of 200 or 300 people. Is there enough being done really in terms of reflecting the population in this sector as well? It's a big challenge. So there's 2 there, but probably tying them together. Yeah.
Well, I think if I can pick up the net zero issue, again, this is very interesting that so funny, we teamed up with Arup about 3 years ago and went, our sector doesn't really know much about how to decarbonise in a sort of sensible way and in a sort of cost benefit way. In terms of, if we've got X amount of cash and Y buildings, what's the best way to do it? Everybody's let down the passive house is garlic bread route, and it's not. It's still to be proven. The data's not there yet. Lots of people are suddenly thinking that passive house is going to save the world. Well, it's very, very expensive, and it's a relatively new technology and approach. Great for those people brave enough to do it. But there are a lot of other very sensible interventions around decarbonisation that are low cost, high impact, and can start hopefully reducing that net carbon down. Again, our sector does not produce enough quality, independent guidance to support the commissioners of that investment. There's 60 million quid being spent on arguably keeping some swimming pools going, some of which should be kept going. Some are very old and quite frankly should be replaced, but they're going to have brand new boilers and heat exchange pumps and solar. Which is great. Now, it's a great political investment, but I really question maybe where some of that money could be going, and we need more money anyway, because, like I said, 127 million was asked for and 60 million was given out, but we shouldn't be surprised there. So I think the decarbonisation piece is absolutely key. There is no independent guide available to our sector right now about that. We tried to get one going 3 years ago and we got no traction at all. I do hope somebody somewhere is taking this seriously and will support the sector in understanding the difference between embodied carbon, for example, the carbon that's built into infrastructure and buildings and concrete, as opposed to operational carbon, which is the stuff when you put your boiler on, that's when you start impacting on on your, and we've got these personal ozone layers above some of these old leisure centres which we need to sort out. So I could go on about that. That's a whole new podcast.
Yeah, absolutely, and probably we will. Yeah, we'll probably return to that, Duncan. I think it's definitely worth it.
But the final one, and I think it's a really, really important one, is there are, and I make a bit of a joke about this, there's too many sort of short, white, middle-aged men like me talking about this sector and making policy decisions, influencing. We're not diverse enough as an organisation. I get hugely frustrated when, even when I'm talking to sort of regional managers in places and they're talking about their own workforce, who may be in a very ethnically diverse community, and they're saying, well, look, our workforce isn't really reflecting our community. We don't have role models. Yeah. And I genuinely think these are things that we can genuinely, they're within our gift. They're not for anybody else to blame. This is about change and about us changing our HR practices and investing in apprenticeships. And I think the whole workforce piece, we cannot achieve our ambition to help this country stay well and live a better quality life if we're paying people minimum wage.
Yeah.
We've got to raise the bar. We've got to professionalise our services and the way we do business and the way we pay and reward people. And we've got to look after our workforce better. There's been some great research on, the quality of life of our workforce, and it's not great. That's why people go off and work as an Amazon delivery driver. Yeah. Or, I remember when I was, running dual use centres, my talented duty managers had quit and go and become a plumber and earn 3 times as much when they were brilliant at their job, and we just didn't have that career pathway for them. So again, I think you've got a whole new podcast on that. We're hopefully just starting that conversation through the article in Health Club Management, which will be coming out around workforce. I think we need to shine a big light on this, because if we can professionalise, we can genuinely start paying people, better remuneration for delivering, preventative health services, as well as providing environments for people to stay well. Then we can really start motoring.
Yeah, and that's come across in some of the other sort of pieces of work, is that it can't attract people if you don't pay and reward them in a way that sort of satisfies modern day living and expenses. So you're right. I think there's just something really shine sort of a light on. So I think we've covered quite a bit, as we knew we would, Duncan, which is what your piece does, doesn't it? Really, sort of it's a good, and it sits really nicely with the active partnerships work and some others. Is this whole place-based sort of stuff and system sort of change and system thinking. So have we missed anything? I think you managed to cover almost everything in your this chat, but sometimes we missed like 1 or 2 little bullet points.
I think we've hit all the key points. I think my one big takeaway, Andy, sure. is that let's not forget the infrastructure that we already have. Yeah. We've got our facilities, we've got those, local authority partnerships and contracts. Within a 5-year cycle, they can be delivering a lot more added value with what we already have. This is about thinking differently, working more collaboratively, and supporting a sustainable range of services within an affordable level. One thing your paper was very keen to emphasise is this isn't going to cost any more money. And certainly the work we're doing is actually about delivering more services and delivering better value back to the public purse. Now, obviously, different local circumstances will mean that people want to do things their own way, which is absolutely brilliant. But when we're talking about place, let's not forget the infrastructure that's already there.
Yeah. So 2 things. Hopefully, you're right. The challenge was, let's be realistic. There isn't going to be lots of new cash in the short term over this next sort of financial period. In fact, there are further cuts coming down the line. So just wanted people to have to think imaginatively rather than just more money, please. So that's been quite a good challenge, and I think people have enjoyed that challenge from what I understand talking to them. But also then that other piece, this is trying to get across that there is a range of things that need to be done. So even the worried well need somewhere to go. So this is not about closing stuff down and pivoting and moving. It's about readjusting, and where people can afford to, then let's make that work for them. But there are a whole series of people, as we know from both that Moving Communities and Active Life survey, they're not moving and they're not able to access a lot of this stuff. So it's just a shift in emphasis and not losing the sport infrastructure and the leisure facility structure and all the rest of it along the way. It's trying to keep both of those sort of alive and giving most people an opportunity to do something in their own locality as far as possible, and then with an active design and active environments, etc., just getting us to move in our communities without the need to go somewhere. So they're all. It's just it's all of this and more, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it's a beautiful synopsis, Andy. I'm not going to say any more now. You've nailed it.
Oh, that's brilliant. Oh, look, Duncan, thank you so much for being part of this. As I say, we've been meeting and talking about this the last, just through COVID more, and then sort of following this through. The pivot's sort of happening, and I think if you went back to where we started this conversation, say 3 or 4 years ago, there have been enormous advances. Probably needs to be embedded far more and deeper right across the whole system, and that's probably the opportunity here, isn't it, to shine a light on what does work, and if we could just replicate what works right across, then we would make some enormous advances. Lots of challenges. I think you've highlighted all of those. It isn't perfect, and I don't think there ever will be a point in which we get to perfect. So let's keep working together collaboratively across this system and make those changes. So Duncan, thank you so much for being with us. It's really good to see you, and I think you've really brought your chapter to life, hopefully in this chat, and have a look at the work that you're doing. I'll put your website in the link after this one, and hopefully people will be in touch.
Page 101 to 105. There you go.
I do apologise for that so many people were so keen on this that.
Right, I'll get over it, Andy. It's fine.
No, we tried to do some sensible order, but it never quite worked. Thanks, Duncan, for your time, and really enjoyed that. It's a great chat.
Thanks so much. Take care. Bye.
Thanks for listening to the latest podcast. Hopefully you found it helpful and you've gained some insights from our guest. If you have enjoyed it today, it would be really helpful to hit the like button and subscribe wherever you get your podcast from. As always, feel free to pop over to any of our social media channels to comment or ask a question. Or sign up to our monthly newsletter at sportsthinktank.com. If you're interested in supporting our work at the Sports Think Tank, again, just head over to the website or drop me an email. Thanks, and see you again next time.